The topic of my little talk today is this painting over here, which I'm sure is a favourite of many of you from the collection of the Aigantighe. Dangerous Documents, documents being most in evident, by Lexton Lewis Pocock. And this talk is going to be something of a deep dive into just what makes this painting tick, who the artist is, and the sorts of things I think about when I look at a painting, particularly a historical painting. So, yeah, the painting, obviously this is redundant, because we have the original there, and I've just noticed another couple of details about it which changes my direction slightly. This is Lexton Lewis Pocock with a magnificent moustache. And he was born on the 23rd of February, 1852 on Gloucester Road in Regent's Park, London. And he was baptised that September in Old Church St Pancras. His father, Lewis Pocock, was an inventor, a patron of the arts, a collector, and a founder of the London Art Union. His mother, which unfortunately I couldn't find nearly as much on, was a woman by the name of Eliza Bassett. The 1861 census has young Lexton attending boarding school at Aldenham in Hertfordshire at the age of 11. And 10 years later, he is once more living at home in London with his parents and many, and I can't overemphasize the many, siblings, because his father had two marriages and there seems to have been children from the previous marriage, and he was quite prolific in both. So young Lexton studied at the Slade School of Art under Sir Edward Poynter, and won a silver medal there. And then he went on to the School of the Royal Academy, where he won another silver medal for life drawing. Although never a member of the Royal Academy, he exhibited there regularly from 1875 onward. He was a member of the Dudley Art Society based in Wolverhampton, which was founded in 1928. And for a lengthy period, he taught at a girls' school in Wimbledon. And he also seems to have worked and taught in Rome for a time, but mostly he seems to have been happiest working in his studio in the part of London known as Little Venice, mostly for its artists and its Italian population. While at the Royal Academy schools, he met his future wife, Alicia Josephine Shellshare, an accomplished artist in her own right, and we find them marrying in Kensington in July 1879. The 1911 census has the pair boarding at Adelaide House, number 13, The Beach, Clevedon in Somerset. I do a lot of research by going through census records, obviously. And the final bits and bobs on them that we can find is Alicia died in 1914 and Lexton died in 1919. So the actual, with the Dudley Art Society, presumably that was an earlier incarnation. One of their daughters, I should say, was Lillian Josephine Pocock, the well-known designer and stained glass artist of the arts and crafts movement, who provided windows for Ely Cathedral, and another daughter, Hilda Stewart, was a prominent portraitist and miniaturist who went to Canada. A son, Alfred Lyndhurst Pocock, became a gem carver and a glassworker for Fabergé. Pocock worked primarily in watercolour, and at this point I would just like to clear up some of the misconceptions about that medium, because I think people often dismiss watercolours as something for weekend amateurs, but if anything it is more technically demanding than oils or acrylic today. Watercolour is a translucent medium and reveals everything, so there's no sort of hiding your mistakes. And it takes a lot of skill to build up the illusion of form and get the colours to do exactly what you want. I might just take this moment to look at a few other paintings by Mr. Pocock. but this is his teacher at the Slade, Sir Edward Poynter, and I think you can already see a certain development of theme going on there. So an interest in historicism. So both Poynter was big on painting set during ancient Rome. So we have, if I get this working, we have this painting here, which is themed after a poem by the Roman poet Catullus. You'll remember Gail, I'm sure. You suffered through that together at some point, I'm sure. Painted in 1907. And another one from 1887, Corner of the Marketplace. So already you can see certain themes are fairly popular in Victorian painting. This is a painting, more of a study, really, that Pocock did while in Rome. So from the ruins of the Temple of Jupiter, the Thunderer, and the Roman Forum. And you can see St. Peter's in the background. Here's another painter, which provides, I think, a useful comparison to dangerous documents. And this illustrates something that certainly Victorian painters are associated with the Pre-Raphaelite movement were inclined to do, which was to base their works on a piece of literature. In this case, it's a song from Shakespeare. And this is the painting, The Fresh Streams Ran By Her, inspired by the Willow Song, sung by Desdemona in Act 4, Scene 3 of Shakespeare's Othello. And it's likely based on an English folk song, and very old, even before the bard got a hold of it. Her hand on her bosom, her head on her knees, sing willow, willow, willow. The fresh streams ran by her and murmured her moans. Her salt tears fell from her and softened the stones. Sing willow, willow, willow. Lay by these, willow, willow. Prithee, hie thee, he'll come anon. Sing all, a green willow must be my garland. Let nobody blame him, his scorn I approve. And obviously the woman waiting for her lover, who's probably done her wrong, if we're going to be very honest, is a popular theme with Pre-Raphaelite painters as well. But we should emphasise here that Pocock was not a Pre-Raphaelite. He was not a member of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and he lacks, I think, their high-minded religiosity. He was certainly an associate of the artists and designers from that group, including people like William Morris and William and Evelyn de Morgan. Late Victorian painters were fascinated by romantic, sentimental, and often idyllic view of England. This is just another comparison, but getting back to the Pre-Raphaelites, this work by Dante Gabriel Rossetti, The Daydream of 1880. I think you can see some similarities, particularly in the rather luxurious fabrics. This is another Pocock. The Closed Way, the frustrated lovers divided by a wall. Again, the fabulous purples and blues in the dress, which I think compares well to this work of a similar vintage by Arthur Hughes, April Love, similar theme, circa 1855 in the Tate Britain. And there's this wonderful purples and blues and this overgrown green lushness, which is also something that was popularised by the Pre-Raphaelites. That's a landscape by Pocock. He did do landscape. There's another landscape by Pocock, soft and almost impressionistic. And you'll see a lot of sort of scenes like this, this also by Pocock. The Microscope, or Consider the Lilies. So young girls gathered around a microscope, this wonderful sort of theme of science and the pastoral idyll almost. Now this fondness for sentimentality and the literary, there's probably a number of reasons for that. Not least, we're dealing with the flourishing Victorian middle class, which was both literate and leisured. but as yet unburdened by easily accessible mass entertainments. So no TV, obviously. The Victorian era was also a period of rapid industrialisation, scientific advance, which we see hinted at in this particular painting. Consider the lilies. So the girls are also lilies, metaphorically speaking, and they're looking at lilies under the microscope. So there's this counterpoint of this sort of romantic notion of that kind of historicising Victorian painting where it's all very flowers and aesthetic, but and science coming in, and they're looking at the details of it, technology intruding. And so we have that industrialisation, scientific advances, urbanisation, so everyone's moving to the cities. And the side effect of this was the grim polluted cities like London and the northern cities, and a large chunk of the population living in rather squalid poverty. And it's hardly surprising that the middle classes might prefer a less complicated fantasy of the past. And compare the previous work with a work by another prominent academic painter, Sir Lawrence Alma Tadema. Again, so historical themes. Again, I think this is Greece, possibly Rome. It's hard to tell because the costumes are rather fanciful, but lots of sprawling around and doing things. And more paintings of young girls. The Victorians had a thing about young girls, and there's they have this sort of complicated obsession with the virginity and purity of young girls. That comes up a lot in the literature as much as the art. So here's another example. John Everett Millais, Autumn Leaves, 1855, from the Manchester Art Gallery. This is another Pocock work, apple picking. Often I have trouble tracking down the dates for a lot of these works. The ones I'm showing you are actually mostly ones that toured to New Zealand with dangerous documents, but I'll get to that in a minute. Another one, Apples, by Pocock, which I think compares rather well. Oh no, that's another Pocock too, which I think was used on a Penguin book cover of the poems of Gerald Manley Hopkins, I seem to recall. But another Victorian theme, death, life, rebirth, beautiful sort of life hereafter, very beautiful Christian sentiments. Another one which is probably just pushing the bounds of being a little bit of a cliche. Cute though. Christian undertones too. If there's a lamb, it's probably Jesus in the 19th century. But compares well with this William Holman Hunt, and William Holman Hunt was a pre-Raphaelite, the Heiling Shepherd, although I don't think the Pocock work is anywhere near as symbolically complicated as this one, which I'm not going to get into because it's horribly, horribly complicated, and I can do an entire lecture on this one. But basically, the young woman is the Anglican faith. The young shepherd is Catholicism, who's trying to have his way with the Anglican faith. And he's actually holding before her a death's head moth, which is obviously a symbolic in the high Anglican mind of the trouble you're going to get into if you start meddling with Catholicism. And sort of apples are temptation and lambs are Jesus, and it's all go. But I mean, that's a subject that's an entire lecture in itself. Here's another Pocock work with the most ridiculous name I think I've come across yet, which is Bucolic Joinings. And if you detect something that a possible suggestion of something a little untoward in that title, you're probably not wrong. But the sort of, down-to-earth, crafty, honest people of the soil is a popular Victorian theme, and sort of vaguely picked up in this painting by another pre-Raphaelite, Sir John Everett Millais. We've already mentioned Sir John Everett Millais, but here he is again, Christ in the house of his parents, which is just Dickens hated because he thought it was sentimental rubbish, and Mary looked like her head was sort of broken off at an angle. And of course Christ has pricked himself on his father's chisel, prefiguring the crucifixion. Dangerous documents arrived in New Zealand in around 1906, so only about 6 years after it was probably painted, along with 10 other paintings by Pocock. in a private collection of 77 watercolours for sale belonging to Mrs. Fletcher Johnston. The collection, featuring English and Australian artists, had previously exhibited at the Royal Academy and Royal Institute in London and toured here. The dates are a bit of a muddle. Yes, and toured here until 1913, and included several of those paintings I have just shown you. Not the Preraphaelites necessarily, but the Pococks, including the Microscope, which the Littleton Times, as you can see here, greatly praised. And the Butterfly, which is Butterfly, the Promise of the New Life, enraptured the Dunedin Evening Post. And this is another way we do a lot of research in New Zealand art history, is by going through Papers Past, which is an archive of a lot of older of various newspapers from around the country, up until about, I think they've got it up as far as the 1950s, I think, at the moment, but it goes all the way back to the earliest newspapers. So we can do a lot to work out context, dates, and so forth. Now, the reason these works were toured to New Zealand for sale, there is a method to this, there's a logic to it, that even when Dangerous Documents was painted, this kind of highly romantic, sentimental history and literary painting was becoming unfashionable. And it was felt that the colonies were probably behind the times enough just to probably be interested and be a likely market for buying these works. And so this is why there's an awful lot of Victorian painting and sort of second-tier Preraphaelite paintings, some very good ones as well, I must admit, in New Zealand collections, in art galleries. Now, one of the things I like about paintings like Dangerous Documents, obviously there's the Littleton Times and the Dunedin Evening Post. What I like about paintings such as Dangerous Documents is they tell you exactly what's going on just by looking at them. And a Victorian would have had understood everything immediately. But unfortunately, our modern eyes sometimes need a little help. And they're about to drop a bundle of documents into some sort of spring or pond. In the background, over there, we see the Roundheads. We can tell from the helmets that these are Roundheads, from Oliver Cromwell's new model parliamentary army. That tells us that the events of the painting take place during the English Civil War, which of course raged in England from 1642 to 1651 and resulted in the beheading of Charles I. From that, we can assume that the pair in the foreground are probably royalists, because why else would Roundheads be burning down their house? So the lavishness of their clothes would suggest associations with the Cavaliers rather than the Puritans. And of course, there's perhaps something of that royalist association, the regal purple, the imperial purple of the dress. No, I'll just skip forward. So there we have some Roundheads, so you know what you're looking at. And this is something that puzzles me about this painting, because here are some, all of them are roughly of the period. This is actually a 19th century and fanciful depiction of a Puritan young woman in the Americas, in America, in New England, which is possibly the one that looks the most like that, which is weird because she's clearly supposed to be some sort of something much more flamboyant and a royalist or someone of aristocratic background. And yet what a woman of her rank and allegiance would be more likely to wear these sorts of things over here with the high lace and the rather heavy, the more decorative bodice and this sort of high lace collar that comes all the way down and the hair out. The headpiece is, it's a bit strange. It's a bit sort of, it seems a bit old for her, or a bit strangely Puritan for her. But then again, I mean, this is a portrait of a Puritan woman, and there's not really that much difference. But there's something peculiar about that. It actually looks more, I think, like either this work from the 1580s, or possibly this rather fanciful depiction of Cleopatra by Tintoretto. I think it's Tintoretto. Actually, I'm probably wrong, it's not Tintoretto. But that's 1730. So what that suggests is either Pocock wasn't very big on historical costume and was just sort of mucking his way through as best he could, which is, you know, entirely feasible, or he's trying to imply something. Perhaps that they are in disguise, that they have disguised themselves and are fleeing. But even so, that doesn't really explain the colours, but there's only so much you can actually convey in a painting, so you do have to take a little leeway. So we presume, to go back, too far, we presume that it is this is their house burning. And then we come to the documents. Now, I've only just noticed that there appears, the signature on it appears to be Sisley, which throws out a lot of my theories, so I'm going to have to follow this up again. I'm not necessarily wrong, but I'm going to have to revisit my observations. The documents, now here's the interesting thing. Now, if you're anything like me, you'd be going, why? What are you doing? Well, the documents are presumably letters, titles, deeds, or something that connect them to the king. So that would obviously be bad for them to be caught with, because it identifies them as royalists and would get them into a lot of trouble. But why not burn them? Why would you tie a rock around them if you wanted to get rid of them? What's going on? My first thought, and I think most people's first thought, is, well, they probably want to retrieve them later. But after many conversations with paper conservators and experts in the field, it gets a bit complicated. See, if it's written on parchment or vellum, which is very thinly flattened out and scraped animal skins, it would disintegrate relatively quickly. They don't stand up well in water. On the other hand, the old oak gall inks that would have been in use at the time are very chemically stable, and so the ink itself might stand up quite well, depending on what they're written on. Now, if it's a cotton rag paper, which certainly was in use at the time, but maybe not for important documents, it would work. So I think we're just going to have to chalk it up to artistic license, because it just doesn't work. And every sort of paper conservator and art conservator I've shown it to and asked about this just found it hysterically funny. Now, as we've established, Pocock often worked from literary sources. And I looked and I scratched my head and I could not think and I could not find of a literary source for this one. Now that if I've clarified what the signature, I might get a bit closer to that, so I'll keep you all posted. But it does rhyme rather well with Frederick Marryat's book, The Children of the New Forest, from 1847. This was the first historical... I've got some pictures. Where are we? There we go. This was the first historical novel written specifically for children and set during the English Civil War and Commonwealth period under Cromwell. And the story describes the fortune of the 4 Beverly children. Unfortunately not Sisley, because that would have made me very happy, but we will look into that further. And the Beverly children are orphaned during the war, and their parents killed, and their father was obviously a royalist, and their house burned down. and the children are forced to hide various incriminating documents, although they rather more sensibly bury them in a chest rather than try to sink them. And then they take shelter with an elderly forester, posing as his grandchildren, as they learn to live off the land and hide from the parliamentary Roundheads. So with all that in mind, it might be fun just to consider these two, name them for the eldest male and female Beverly Children, Edward and Alice, because they rather look like an Edward and Alice, perhaps. I don't know, but that's just me. Now, as we've seen, Pocock has a penchant for purple and blue dresses. Actually, we'll just briefly look at these. Now, these are a descendant or a relative somewhere in the family of Mr. Pocock very kindly sent these pictures to the gallery, so we're very lucky to have them. These are from his sketchbook. So we can actually see him planning out the composition of his painting and trying out different compositions. Let's make sure. So this one is obviously much more, the male figure is much more sort of prominently visible. This one's probably is another study. So these two, and he's sort of thinking, we'll do it this way, we'll do it this way, and then he changes his mind. And these are some more sketches from that notebook, that sketchbook. And these conform a lot more closely, I think, to the final painting. It's not very often you actually get an opportunity to see the process behind the painting. So that's rather exciting and very nice to have. Now, Dangerous Documents is sometimes compared to a painting by one of the founders of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. We've already met him a couple of times already so far, John Everett Millais. And this particular painting is one that it's compared to fairly often. A Huguenot on St. Bartholomew's Day of 1852. And by comparing the two, it helps us to draw out some of the Pre-Raphaelite tropes and themes that Pocock was drawn to. We can see it. They both are big on the purple dress. Of course, purple had only sort of come in as an inexpensive fabric dye probably about middle of the 19th century, the aniline dyes. They were the first synthetic dye available on the market, so there was a huge outpouring of purple dresses and people got very excited about it. And so perhaps that's an explanation as to why he seems so infatuated with the colour purple and young women in purple dresses. And why the other Victorian paintings were as well, painters rather. So the Millais painting is set just before or on the day of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in France in 1572. So a brief historical recap. What we have here is a young Roman Catholic girl in purple, which I suspect might be suggestive of her religious orientation. And she is tying a white band around the arm of her Protestant Huguenot lover. And of course, as we've sort of seen, star-crossed lovers do tend to be something that the Victorians were rather fond of. Now, the white band is how the Catholic party identified themselves on during the day of the massacre, so that they didn't massacre each other. And so she's trying to save him by tying this decoy white band around his arm, and he's sort of poo-pooing it and patting her on the head in a slightly condescending fashion as she's trying to save his life. And yes, and he probably got massacred. They both have this this lush green, this overgrowth surrounding them that frames them. And I think that's something that is rather typical of a lot of pre-Raphaelite painting, but is something that comes over from their interest in the early Renaissance. And they're backed by these earth tones that are very similar. So the palette is very similar. You've got the purples, you've got the greens, and the bricks chime rather nicely with the earth colours behind in the pocock. So by the time the Fletcher Johnston collection arrives in Timaru in 1913, it has been very well received in the newspapers around the country, and it was displayed at the O'Callaghan and Lachrenn auction mart, which later was. Actually, I've got a few more 19th century paintings of cavaliers or similar themes. This one isn't. This is a oh no, what? No, it's gone. I've forgotten the particular historical event, unfortunately. But again, sort of the sentimentality. The returned warrior in this case. He's been sent back because he's wounded, and of course the stoic Scottish wife is going to nurse him back to health, and good Scottish type there. This is a depiction. This is a scene from the Civil War, from the English Civil War. So this is by Samuel Edward Waller. It's another similar sort of theme: sweethearts and wives, and so the women they left behind, and so presumably we have them saying goodbye to each other as they go off to war. Another one, which is a very famous one by William Frederick Yeames. Lovely name, Yeames. When did you last see your father? And this is the sort of themes that pop up a lot in these paintings of the Civil War. So that he's before the magistrates or who want to know where his father, his presumably cavalier father, is, and the family is his sister is just sort of is traumatized, and the boy is being very noble. He's not going to give his father's whereabouts away. And it's so famous as this one, it was parodied by another artist, Terence Cuneo. He was rather famous, not overly serious painter of the 20th century. Here they are as mice, which I thought was rather fun, so I thought I'd throw that in because otherwise it was getting a bit serious and depressing. And the wonderfully named William Shakespeare Burton, how many playwrights can you get into one name? The Wounded Cavalier. And very pale, obviously bleeding to death. So that's where they were, the O'Callaghan and Lachrenn auction mart, which later became the Regent Theatre before it was demolished. And its arrival, because of all the publicity in the newspapers, it built up a lot of excitement in Timaru. And we find J.P. Newman, who was the first president of the South Canterbury Chamber of Commerce and a member of the Timaru Art Society, writing a letter to the editor of the Timaru Herald asking if any readers were interested in subscribing to raise funds to make a purchase. And the people of Timaru, as they often are, were munificent in their response, and Dangerous Documents was purchased for just over £62, which in today's money is around $10,600. So quite a lot. I worked that out on an app. So if I'm wrong, it's their fault, not mine. And in May of that year, the Herald also reported that the painting was to be part of the nucleus, was their word, of artworks secured for the Timaru Art Gallery. And thus, I get into my denouement. It joined the Grant family art collection when Helen Grant left the family home and grounds, Aigantighe, to the people of Timaru, opened as the Aigantighe Art Gallery in 1956. And here we are. And I think it's one of the finest collections outside of a main centre in New Zealand. And I think we're all very lucky to have it. And this generosity and from the people of Timaru, probably quite a lot of it was patriotism for the empire, English art and so forth, a desire to feel connected to Mother England at a time of rising international tensions because the First World War would break out the following year. But none of this would have happened without the collective generosity and public interest of Timaruvians, who love their city and are proud of it. And I hope Timaru has that civic spirit still. And I encourage you to rally around the Aigantighe to support this wonderful institution. That's a beautiful historical photo. It's an absolutely magnificent building. And, so glad it's being protected and looked after. The end. And now I will throw the floor open to questions if there are any, if I can indeed answer them.
Great work, Andrew. It's got me all interested.
I think there's so much, a single work can have so much going on in it and around it. And this is my job, really, this is what art historians do. We tell you what's going on in the painting, why it was made, when it was made, what was going on in the society that made it, and how we can tell what they might have been thinking about and what was going on in the world at the time to cause them to choose a particular theme, for instance. We can tell you the story of what's actually going on in the painting. And of course, there's the whole story, which people tend to forget about often, of provenance and how it actually gets to where it is. So what's the story between the actual making of it and when it is here in the gallery, how does it get here? Which I think is a very worthy story in its own right. And you can see that it's very easy to draw out an entire lecture on one painting. One could probably go on, but at a certain point it gets a little bit pointy-headed, and then you start talking about chemical compositions of pigments and so forth, and what exactly is a body colour, which is a kind of paint that is used to get the skin tones and watercolour and things like that. And I mean, for years I've wondered about this thing with the documents. Why are they dropping them? I mean, okay, like most people, I think we all assume, they're obviously going to retrieve them at some point, because otherwise why wouldn't you destroy them? But it was quite a rabbit hole in itself, trying to find out, well, would this work? Is this feasible, or is he just talking silly buggers? So no, unless it's cotton paper, it wouldn't work. But it's a nice story.
Is he dropping them into the water?
Well, it appears to be. They're not dripping.
It worries me every time I look at it, because unless he's put it in a plastic bag,
I'm not sure those were awfully common during the war.
Completely expunged because the ink will be soluble.
Well, I'm assured by some experts in the field of document care, particularly of European documents of a fairly hefty length of time, that it should be that the oak inks are very, very chemically stable. So that's not the problem. The ink is fine. The issue is the paper, or whatever it's written on. That's the big one. And if it's parchment, it will just sort of turn to mush and disintegrate. If it's cotton rag paper, there's a good chance it would last, a little while and could be retrieved later. So that's perhaps what he's getting at. Now that I've actually, because I haven't had the opportunity to get up this close to it before, because usually I'm sort of at a fairly respectful distance, as one is from paintings, and actually you can see that the signature. There is a name on the document, and it appears to be Sisley, which was a fairly prominent family in England during the Civil War. Lots of historical connotations there. So now that I know that, I'm going to follow that up, and I shall inform the gallery, and no doubt they shall make that information public if I dig out any more on it. Sorry, I think you had a question.
You've just answered it. I was intrigued. Thank you for the talk, but I'm just intrigued about that wee thing you dropped in there about the name you'd seen and where that was taking you. So you have answered. Thank you.
Yeah, it's right here. It's not off. I mean, because when you're in the gallery setting, you're usually about here. And but actually being able to get up close, it definitely looks like it. I think it is definitely. Oh no, I could be wrong. It looks like Sisley to me. It's hard to make out because of the way it's written in a very florid script, which could open up a lot more information about what the story actually is. And the rather ludicrous costume still. I can't get to the bottom of that because it just doesn't look right for the period. Because it doesn't look right. It really doesn't. It looks very anachronistic. It looks almost sort of Elizabethan in a way. It doesn't, but it's probably artistic license and fancifully cobbled together from various sources. Beautiful painting though, and you get up close, it's so deftly painted, and the way he captures the skin tones, and there's just the faint blush on her cheek. And comes back to that point I was making about watercolour, and people think, watercolour, that's something sort of little old ladies do at the weekend, pottering around sort of, there's this attitude that's still, I think, very prevalent. Not that I'm dismissing little old ladies who paint. Grandma Moses was going for a very long time after all. But watercolour is very unforgiving. It's incredibly unforgiving. It's not a Sunday amateur medium at all, really, although a lot of people do paint landscapes as amateurs with watercolour. But I mean, in many ways, oils and acrylics are far easier to deal with. Not that he would have had acrylics, but oils are much easier to deal with, although they're a pain in the ass when it comes to drying times. Excuse my Anglo-Saxon, because it takes. If it's damp weather and it's not warm enough, oil paints can take ages to dry, and sometimes never do entirely, which are a conservator's nightmare. But in terms of actually painting with them, if you make a mistake, you can just paint over the top of it. You can't do that with watercolour. So anyone who can get these effects with watercolour is a fantastic artist. And of course, he went to the Slade and the Royal Academy School, so he was an exemplary painter, very well trained.
How many paintings did he do?
Sorry?
How many paintings would have been painted?
Ooh, I don't know. He was prolific. He seems to have shown in just about every show at the Royal Academy from, what was the starting date? From about 1875 until close to his death. Every year he had one or two works, at least. Often sort of based on a snippet of poetry or something like that.
And was he commercially viable in his time?
Well, I suspect there would have been a market for it, but he probably was already becoming slightly unfashionable by 1900 when this was painted. Earlier on, yes, tastes were changing because the sort of excessive sentimentality and the sort of very Victorian approach to things was becoming a little bit passé by that stage. I mean, people still would have bought it, but that's why, so it's only a very short period of time after it was painted that it gets shipped down to the Antipodes in the hope of that the tasteless barbarians down here would snap it up, which obviously they did. And thank for that, because we have this wonderful work.
Just as a postscript entry, there's a beautiful mauve Victorian dress in the South Canterbury Museum.
Yes, there is. And I think there probably is an aniline dye as well. So, I mean, that being a very sort of exciting development, as I think I said. It is a beautiful purple. But not to be taken as serious history, which is something to reiterate with his paintings.